I'm very excited to be here. I guess each time I come to California, there are some other new surprises coming. And it is in this part of the country that we had our first workshops on life after death, which would have been inconceivable in Chicago, where I come from, where people think I must have really slipped. I have seen too many dying patients. I'm also excited to hear men of physics stand up here and talk about consciousness, about cosmic web, things that would have been totally inconceivable 10 years ago. And perhaps the most exciting thing for me personally, who is an Indian fan and who has always had a big dream of one day seeing Rolling Thunder, is the excitement I experienced this morning when I realized that I'm not only going to be able to see him, but I sleep under the same roof. I really didn't want to come here. I wanted to stay there. What I'm going to talk about today, I think, is about life, death, and transitions. When you work with dying patients, and especially dying children, for 10 years, and you watch the people face the reality of a potentially terminal illness, you watch them go through the anguish, the shock, the denial, the rage, the anger, the bargaining with God, the depression, and see that they have incredible internal assets to come to grips with such tragedies. Then you begin to wonder where this strength comes from, but you also begin to wonder why we, and especially we of the helping profession, make such a big nightmare out of death and dying. You begin to wonder why we have to prolong life at all cost. You begin to wonder if a human being is really only a physical body. There must be more to it. You watch children die and you listen to them and you learn the symbolic language they talk to you, and you suddenly begin to realize that very young children, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, not only know that they die, but they know when they die. And they tell you that, if you can hear it. And you begin to raise questions, how do children know that? And I'm not only referring to children, but I'm most impressed that even young children know those things. My work with dying patients didn't start with the seminars on death and dying. That was simply a very logical consequence of my previous existence. My work perhaps started the moment I was born. My parents had a 6-year-old boy and wanted, like very normal couples, wanted another little girl. And my mother got pregnant and I was born, and my parents were absolutely horrified and disappointed because I was a 2-pound nothing. And 10 minutes later another 2-pound baby came, and 15 minutes later a 6.5-pound baby came. And they were blessed with triplets. And I think because nobody really expected me to live, it was almost all my life that I had the feeling that I had to do something special to justify that it was okay that I stayed alive. And I'm meaning that very seriously, and I wasn't aware of this for many, many years. But what impressed me most, looking back at the beginning of my life, is that though we were totally unexpected, nobody even expected twins because we were so tiny, My mother had a very incredible knowledge of how to help us survive. She took those 3 tiny, tiny babies out of the hospital and believed very strongly that if she would nurse us every 3 hours for 9 or 10 months, and she would simply hold and hug and love us and nurse us, that we would have a chance to live. And naturally everybody in the hospital thought it's totally crazy, those children will never make it. Well, I'm not very huge, but I'm here. I think that was my first lesson, that there is more to care, to medical care, than machines, than incubators, and all the other things that we do to people. The much more important ingredient is the touch, the love, and the care, and I think the faith and the confidence that if we're born here for something, and at least you have to give these little people a chance. Years later, I ended up doing relief work in post-war Europe. And I came to Majdanek, to the concentration camps. And I think what touched me more than anything else in my life is the smell of the gas chambers, the trainloads of baby shoes, of human hair, concentration camps where 963,000 children were killed. And when you see this with your own eyes and you smell it with your own nose, you don't just read it in a magazine, you begin to raise questions not so much about life and death, but I think you begin to raise questions what goes wrong in the upbringing of a human being that can turn a human being into a Hitler or into a Nazi, and what is different in somebody who ends up being, for example, a Mother Teresa. And that was, I think, my quest, my search, when I then went back to Switzerland and started to study medicine in an attempt at least to do something about mankind, even in a tiny little way. Those of you who have heard the lecture this morning, I presume that you are prepared for the fact that we are not just physical bodies, but that we also have to accept the reality of our consciousness, that we have to learn to get in touch with our own inner knowledge, with our own wisdom, and our long forgotten, probably, and repressed understanding of things that may not fit into our present-day limited scientific understanding, but will become quite clear, I'm sure, when the age of science is replaced with the age of spirituality, which is now on its way in. And all of you in this room, I think, should thank God for allowing you to be witness and builders of this new age of love and compassion, and I think finally again a harmonious symbiosis of man with nature. And since this is our bicentennial, I think it is important to understand that the people who inhabited this country before we came knew all these things and that we learned something from them. They also knew much more about life and death. They knew how to prepare for death, and they did a much better job than we are doing now. And I think you don't have to go all the way east to China or to India to learn, because those people are living among us, if we would only give them credit for it. And I think I'm saying that to those of you who cannot afford a trip to India like I cannot afford to go there. Those people are right here with us. Somebody asked at the end of the question and answer period what life is. When you sit with dying patients, and especially with dying children, you begin to understand what life is. you begin to see what kind of patient dies with peace and equanimity without much counseling, and what kind of people are very uptight and struggle and fight till the very end and never really find peace. My most significant teacher, perhaps, in this whole work with death and dying was a black cleaning woman. 10 years ago, when I was very much of a black sheep at the University of Chicago, very much persona non grata, everybody wished me to disappear and not show up anymore. And when you are in a very difficult spot in your life and you somehow continue because deep down something inside tells you that this is all right, you become almost like an animal during hunting season. You become very hyper-aware of your environment, and I think this is a self-preservation phenomena where you begin to see how far out you can go on a branch before it breaks. But you become a very super specially good psychiatrist during those times. Not with your patients necessarily, but with the people that surround you and whose survival, who make you or break you. During this time on the ward, where I really walked on extremely thin ice, I watched a black cleaning woman walk in and out of the rooms doing her job, but something about me struck her. Each time she was in a room of a dying patient, something happened in that room. And I would have given a fortune to find out what she's doing. And one day I remembered my own teachings to my medical students, and I said, you know, I'm silly. I always tell my students, if you want to know something, ask. So I followed my own teaching. I cornered this black cleaning woman, and I asked her, I'm sure in a very silly way, I said, what are you doing with my dying patients? And she became very defensive, almost paranoid. She said, oh, I'm not doing anything, I only clean the rooms. And I tried to explain to her that's not at all what I'm talking about, but by then she was so conditioned to mistrust people like me that she walked away. We snooped around each other for weeks. Do you know what I mean by that? After snooping around each other for weeks, trying to figure out who the other person is, she must have trusted me because we had a meeting behind the nursing station on her initiative. And she suddenly shared a very important lesson for me, which at that time was out of context and I really didn't understand it terribly well. She shared how she grew up in a ghetto in Chicago, in a dreadful neighborhood, sick children, cold flats, not enough food for her children, no medication when they were sick. And then she added one tragedy after the other. One example she gave is that she sat at the county hospital with her 3-year-old boy on her lap, desperately waiting for a physician to come, and after about 3 hours of waiting, her little boy died in her lap of pneumonia. And she shared one tragedy after the other like this, and I was just ready to say, why do you tell me all this? What has this to do with my dying patients? And as if she could read my mind, she said, you see, Dr. Ross, death is not a stranger to me anymore. He's like an old acquaintance, and I'm not afraid of him anymore. And sometimes I walk into the room of these dying patients and they look so scared. I can't help but walk over to them and touch them and say, it's not so terrible. Do you understand that I promoted this woman to my first assistant, much to the dismay of my academic colleagues? They didn't like me any better for that. But what this woman taught me is a terribly important lesson that we do not teach enough in our professional education. And I don't only mean medicine, I mean that in all professional education. This woman knew something that I still had to learn. And that is, I think, what clergy try to teach you when they tell you that there is a meaning in suffering. I never believed that. I thought that's a nice sentence. They just tell you this so you keep quiet and don't lament too much, but they don't believe that themselves. Until I met this woman and I realized that naturally human beings who go through a very difficult life, who experience losses, tragedies, nightmares, each time they go through one of these experiences, they naturally go through the stages of dying, which are not typical just for dying, but all of us go through shock and denial, anger, depression, or bargaining when we lose anything. If you lose your vision, if you should become a paraplegic, if you lose your pet, people who live in a home and it burns down or they are moved to a nursing home. Some people, if they are in a process of separation or divorce, if you lose your boyfriend or girlfriend, and some people, even if they only lose their contact lenses, go through the stages of dying. If you have experienced this 1,000 times, each time you come closer to its concept of peace and acceptance and can accept these tragedies better. We call this our little deaths. All people who have a terminal illness have to go through many little deaths before the final death occurs. Little girls with leukemia who are on chemotherapy, who lose their gorgeous blonde hair, go through a little death. A man who faces the reality that he cannot keep a job anymore goes through a little death. If I couldn't pack the lunch boxes for my children anymore, that would be a little death. So I would say that the little deaths are really lessons in letting go, to prepare you for the tasks ahead in life and for life itself. Because what is life if not the chain of little deaths and rebirths, joys and pains and hellos and goodbyes? This is all there is to life. All of you have to go through school of learning, and you graduate from life when you have learned your lessons of life, when you have learned to see the joys and especially the pains and sorrows, not as chance happenings, and certainly never as a punishment of God, but as gifts, and that's gifts to learn from, to grow, to become less attached, and with this much more aware of the fact that nothing, and I mean nothing, belongs to you, and that includes even your children. Human beings do not belong to one another. Children do not belong to their parents. They are alone to us. And I think if we could learn this at a young age, we wouldn't be so totally unprepared for deaths in our own family. We would also be much more comfortable facing our own finiteness eventually. When you work with these patients over a long period of time, you begin to wonder what death is all about, why some people have to go through horrendous nightmares, why others accept it with the greatest peace and equanimity, and why we of the helping profession make such a nightmare out of it. The dying in our society at the present time has indeed become a nightmare. We learned very soon that people are afraid when they walk into a room of a dying patient. They're afraid what to say and what to do. What they are afraid of is naturally their own gut reactions. Because patients remind you of your own finiteness. And your reaction, you walk into a room, is immediately a wish to take off, a wish to talk about the lovely weather outside, avoidance. You feel grief, pain, sorrow, helplessness, hopelessness, and the patient picks this up. And you can be assured that the patient will not talk with you about dying if you feel this way. And the question is, how can you learn to overcome those gut reactions, which the great majority of our population has? One way of coming to grips with it is to get to know yourself, and there is nobody better who can teach you about life and death and help you to come to peace with your own finiteness and a dying patient, and especially dying children. This work has led to more and more curiosity, not only how to counsel dying patients and their families, but I watch my patients whom I love dearly, most of them. I get very involved with them. I take all my patients home to die. We take children home to die so that the siblings and the parents can be with them, so they are in their own familiar environment. And our only big problem is practically never the patient, but it's the staff. It's the staff and it's the grown-ups who cannot be where the child is yet. And I give you some very practical examples how to resolve that and what we learn from these experiences. Last December, I attended a 12-year-old girl who had a malignancy. She had terrible problems. The physicians wanted her in the hospital very desperately, and she wanted to die at home. The parents were ambivalent simply because there was no physician who was willing to make house calls. When they asked if I would be willing to take over the case, their own physicians at the university hospital recommended that they do not get in touch with me because my presence might imply to the 12-year-old that she might be dying. And the family was very upset about this because they had faced the reality, the girl had faced the reality, and finally, when she was much too weak to be moved back and forth to Chicago from the village where she lived, I was able to take over the case. I sat with the siblings in the living room. We drew pictures together so I had an idea where they were at. They were very, very ready to face the reality. The parents were ready. But Liz, the 12-year-old girl who was not afraid to die per se and was very prepared for it, could not die. She was just hanging in and in and in for days after days after days, until one day I realized that she must have something that still prevents her from dying. And when symbolic language doesn't work and I just couldn't figure it out, I asked her straightforward one day, shortly before Christmas, I said, Liz, something prevents you from dying, what is it? And she said, yes, I can't die because I can't go to heaven. And I have very strong gut reactions about that, and I always have to bite my tongue. I was ready to say, who told you this, watchman call it. And you cannot do this in this work. That is one of the hardest aspects of this work, is that you cannot help people and knock other people at the same time. You cannot help in a community if you do that. So I told her, I said to her, who told you that? She said, my priest and the sisters who come and visit me have told me repeatedly that nobody goes to heaven unless you have loved God more than anybody else in the whole wide world. And then she whispered in my ear as if she tried to prevent God from hearing her. She said, you see, I love my mommy and daddy better than anybody in the whole wide world. Do you understand my conflict? I said to her, I cannot get into an argument with you about your priest. We are obviously on a different wavelength. But I'm trying to share with you how we have always shared together in our language, meaning you and me. I said we have often talked together about school. This is a 12-year-old who wanted to become a teacher. And I said your saddest day this fall was in September when school started again, and it suddenly hit you that you will never, ever again go back to school. And she said, yes, it was by far the saddest day of my life. And I said, you always wanted to become a teacher, and she nodded. I said, okay, I want you to ask you one question. Sometimes I forgot to mention to you that she was on an honor roll. She was one of the best students in her class. And I said to her, sometimes your teacher gives some of you in the class some very, very tough assignments. Does she give these tough assignments to the lousy students? Or does she give it to everybody in the class? Or does she give it just to very few? And her face lit up, and with great pride in her face, she said she only gives it to very few of us. And I said, okay, since God is also a teacher, do you think he gave you a tough assignment or a very easy one that he can give to just anybody? And then she was lying back on her back, and she looked at her very protruded belly, and her arms were just like skin and bones. And she really looked dreadful. And she looked down at herself with joy and pride. And she said, I don't think God could give a tougher assignment to any child. And I said, what do you think he thinks of you? Do you understand the symbolic language we're using together? This was the end of all conflict. 2 days later I visited her once more, and before I could open my mouth, she looked down at her belly and she had the biggest smile on her face. And she died about 3 days later, not afraid that she would be acceptable. It is very important that we as human beings are not judgmental, and that we try to get in touch where the patients are so that we can really communicate with them and hear their fears, and sometimes what prevents them from dying. Because people have much more to say about the timing of their death than we ever give them credit for. There is very rarely a patient who has important unfinished business and they die prematurely. When you can help them to finish their unfinished business, they die sometimes within 24 hours. And I'm not talking about mercy killing, and I'm also very opposed to prolongation of life ad infinitum. But I think if we could help our patients to face the pain and the anguish not as a punishment or as a horrible thing, but a last opportunity perhaps for growth, for finding their own inner strength, their own inner assets. And the most important thing to do is not to leave them alone in this struggle. If they have another human being who can share this with them, this can be one of the most beautiful, unique experiences, not only for the patient but also for you, because a little bit of this peace and of this freedom that comes out of this will rub off on you. And if you have done this a few hundred times, you cannot possibly be afraid of death and dying anymore. This research then led to a new research project, and that is a study of what death actually is. When you watch dying patients and you have a deep, moving, personal relationship with them, and you touch them and you talk to them and you look into each other's eyes, and a minute after they are dead, there is a corpse in that bed that to me feels like an old winter coat, that I'm ready to discard in the spring when I have no more use for it. You begin to see death as something very, very significant. You would like to know more about it. And I never quite understood why in this age of science, where we have such super brilliant minds, where we can take men to the moon and bring them back, and we can put machines on Mars and study the soil, that nobody has ever done research on death to really know what death is and what happens to people, to the person, to the inner person, not just the body. My other thing that intrigued me is that many, many of my patients had this incredible appearance of peace on their face. And those are not all patients who died in peace and acceptance. They died with dignity, and that means they died in character. That means fighters and rebels died fighting and being rebels. People who used to be chronic deniers died in denial, and that's really what it means to die with dignity. But yet all of them shared this expression of peace on their face. And the last thing that intrigued me is that many, many of these people started to talk to people who died before them. And this usually occurs about 2 or 3 days before death occurs, that they begin to communicate with someone I can't see. And naturally we are very quick labeling this hallucination, but it was much too real to just be satisfied with a label. One patient helped us to find an avenue to do research in this, and that was a woman who had been in intensive care unit 15 times. She was hospitalized on an emergency basis in a small local hospital in Indiana, where she experienced what it is like to die. She was just hospitalized in a private room, very critically ill, when she saw herself floating out of her physical body, floating a few feet above her physical body, and looked down at her corpse in utter amazement, and then watched a resuscitation team come into her room and was able to tell us who came in first, who came in last, what they wore, how they behaved, and what they said. She had an incredible feeling of peace and only one need, and that is to tell them down there, cool it, relax, take it easy, it's all right. Those are her own words. And the more desperate she tried to convey this to them, the more frantic they became. I'm using her own words. Until she realized that she's able to actually perceive them, but they are not able to perceive her. And then again in her own language, I gave up on them and I lost consciousness, which is a nice lack of language naturally. This is during 45 minutes when she had no vital signs whatsoever. She was even able to repeat the joke of one of the residents who became very apprehensive. Now this doesn't make any sense to somebody who has a very mechanistic physical model of understanding. But she gave us an idea that we might search for other people who have had this experience, and if we would get hundreds of cases, maybe even the skeptical scientists would believe that human beings consist of more than just a physical body. This was 8 years ago. We have since collected hundreds and hundreds of cases, from 2-year-olds to 93-year-olds, from Australia to California. We kept this research a top secret for 7 years. Not even my own husband knew about it, out of fear that if we would publicize any of this, that the data would be contaminated. Do you understand how I mean that? Once it's published, you do get lots of cases, but you never know whether people adjust their own experiences to what they read. And so we blind just collected data until we had plenty of data, and I'll summarize very briefly for you the common denominator of what people share with us of their own experience at the moment of death, at the moment when we declare them as dead and they for some reason were able to make a comeback, and that is not only minutes after they have been declared dead. Our longest case has been 12.5 hours. People at the moment of death, and I must say that more than half of our cases are sudden, unexpected deaths, accidents. People at the moment of their death are fully conscious, fully aware of the separation of themselves and their floating out of their physical body. At that time there is a great sense of peace for all people that we have so far. A feeling that must be very much like a butterfly coming out of a cocoon. They are able to perceive everything that's going on. They're in full capacity of their perceptions. They have a feeling of serenity, freedom and peace, which means explicitly no pain, no panic, no fear, no anxiety. Most of our patients have been very, very unhappy, reluctant or resentful of our attempts to bring them back to life, because that also meant that they go back into a physical body full of pain and anguish. None of our patients has ever again been afraid to die. Many of them were longing for death but realized that suicide was not the answer, so they have to patiently wait until the time is right. The other common denominator is that at the moment of this transition into a higher state of consciousness, they have a feeling of wholeness, and that is a very physical kind of wholeness. One man who was killed by a hit-and-run driver saw his own leg amputated on the highway, and when he was out of his physical body, he has both legs. Or a woman who was totally and irreversibly blinded in a laboratory explosion, the moment she was out of her physical body, was able to see, and described the scene of the accident, of the laboratory, of the people who tried to rescue and help her. When she came back into her physical body, naturally she was totally blind again. The most beautiful part perhaps of this research, and that concerns me most since I work almost exclusively now with dying children, is that you are never ever going to be alone. And that is that at the moment of transition there is someone there to help you in this transition and to prepare you for this and to be sure that you're never ever deserted. You can die on an island alone, and you will not be alone. And I think this is important to know, because my patient's biggest fear is that they're left alone, that there is nobody around. They can be sure that they're never going to be alone. The person who is going to be with you is someone who has died before you, always, and whom you have loved. That's the common denominator. It is your father, your mother, your child, your grandmother, whoever you have truly loved and who has preceded you in death. When we had hundreds of cases, my big concern was who is going to be there for my children. Not my own children, but my children, my patients, my children. There are 2, 3, 4, 6-year-olds who die of cancer, of leukemias, and they have not had a death in the family. They still had their mommies and daddies and grandmas and grandpas. And who else needs this more than a little child who is afraid to be alone? until a year and a half ago when we received our first, and so for our youngest case. It was a very moving experience in Virginia where I gave a lecture to a huge audience of about 1,000 people. I had never talked about this in public. And at the end of the presentation, a woman got up, looked very desperate, and she said, I really only came here for one question. If I would only know what happens the moment the child dies. And she looked so desperate that I forgot all my concerns, and you understand that a physician, scientist who already has a bad reputation as being a death and dying lady is a bit leery talking about things like that. The hostility that you get is incredible. Physicians are very upset with me because they are worried that I'm turning now into a minister, which implies an insult. The priest came to me and said, do you know what you're doing? And I said, what do you think I'm doing? And he looked at me with disgust and he said, you're trying to sell cheap grace. And the Protestant ministers give me the hardest time. They said this is something that one ought to believe and not know. And then there are some sick people who send me lovely messages. If it's that beautiful on the other side, I'd be glad to come over and help you. And they are very serious homicidal threats, and they mean it because they're really petrified about this. So you understand with all this feedback that you're very leery talking about this in public. When this became public, the newspaper people are the worst because they make my life miserable. They put a big headline in the Herald Tribune, Chicago Tribune, psychiatrist discovers life after death. My husband didn't talk to me for 2 days. And I share this with you that I'm not here to share something lightly, but I really had to think about it for a long time before I was able to talk about this in public. Now I don't have a shadow of a doubt that death does not exist. Death is simply a shedding of a physical body, and people have to know that. This woman came up and she looked so desperate, I really couldn't care a hoot about what the whole 1,000 people thought in that audience. She just needed an answer at that moment. And so I shared with her what I just shared with you a minute ago, and something very beautiful happened. This mother came running up here, grabbed the second mic, which I had used for a patient interview before, and she shared with me something in total privacy of 2 people, and we were both oblivious that 1,000 people hear us, both holding on to her mic. And she shared how 11 years ago her 2-year-old child died of a drug reaction, and her physician was out of himself, and she was just totally numb. She was waiting for her husband to show up, when suddenly her 2-year-old Peter opened his eyes and looked at her like an old wise man, and this 2-year-old said to her at that moment, "Mommy, I was dead." And she wanted to shut him up because no mother wants to talk about something like this after such a traumatic experience. And he insisted that he had to tell her. And just to get it over with, she allowed him to proceed, and he said, "I was dead, and it was such a beautiful place that I did not want to come back." And no mother likes to hear that, so she tried to shut him up again. And he insisted that it was very important that she hears the end of it. And he then proceeded telling her that he was in such a beautiful place that he did not want to come back. He was with Mary and with Jesus. And Mary held him and was full of love. And he tried to not hear that she kept telling him that the time was not right, that she had to go back. And when Mary realized that he tried to ignore her, she took him gently by the wrist and pulled him away and said to him, Peter, you have to go back, you have to save your mother from the fire. And Peter then said to his mommy, you know, mommy, when she told me that, I ran all the way back home. And at that moment he opened his eyes. This mother kept this a secret for 11 years, not able to share this with anybody, because of people who are so narrow-minded and judgmental that they would either knock it, or they would label it, or they would belittle it. She could not dare to share this. What was even more tragic is that this woman was depressed for 11 years because she truly believed that the statement of Mary to Peter implied that she was a bad woman and that it was up to her son to ultimately save her. And I told her that is totally wrong. The only way I can help you is by telling you that what Peter experienced is absolutely identical with what all our patients experience at the moment of death. And this is a reality, and this did happen to Peter. Where you're really wrong is your interpretation of what Mary said to Peter. I said, if you can stop thinking for a while and experience what it was like 11 years ago, what do you think it would have been like 11 years ago if Mary would not have sent Peter back to you? And she grabbed her head and she said, oh my God, I would have gone through hell and fire. And I said, well, didn't she send Peter back to save you from that fire? We have beautiful cases. Scientists naturally say this is all wishful thinking. When you're petrified, you imagine somebody to be with you, and that's what they report to you. This cannot be, because of the hundreds of children I have attended over the last many years. I always ask my dying children, if you could pick one human being to be with you all the time, whom would you choose? And almost every white child, there are cultural differences, almost every white child says mommy or daddy. Not one of these children has ever seen mommy or daddy. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? If mommy and daddies are still alive, not one of them has seen mommy or daddy. An Indian gave me one of the most beautiful examples. I was in Arizona about a year ago. One of my pastime when I lecture is to screen the audience and see if there are interesting people. And in the audience I saw a very old couple of American Indians. A woman who must have been in her 90s with her daughter who must have been in her 70s. And I wondered what these people are doing in this one-day lecture on death and dying. Those are not people who usually need to come to a lecture like this. So I suddenly sensed that they're here for a very important purpose. One other thing we learned in this research is that nothing is coincidence. So I knew that this was not coincidence that those people are there and that I find them among 1,000 people. So at the end of the lecture, I needed to connect with them, but alone. So I was hiding in a bathroom for about 10 minutes until everybody dispersed. And then I went out, and sure enough, they were standing out there in the hallway all alone. And I walked over to them and I asked them where they came from. They came from very far away from a reservation. And after a while of kind of superficial connection, the old woman nodded to the young woman, like giving her the cue. And the younger woman then shared with me that her sister was killed on a highway, hundreds of miles away from the reservation, by a hit-and-run driver. And another car stopped, tried to help her. And she died within a few minutes, but before she died, in the arms of this stranger, she said to him, make sure to tell my mother that I'm all right and that I'm very happy because I'm with Dad. Her father died within 1 hour on the reservation, hundreds of miles away. Do you understand why I'm sharing these examples with you? We have enough evidence to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that death simply means a transition into a higher state of consciousness, that we shed the body when we don't need it anymore, and that when you lose a loved one, if you have really loved them, that is a very temporary separation, that you're going to be together again. I have to say one more word about what the Church teaches about hell and heaven. Because my other reluctance publishing any of this was not only that we didn't have any cases of children, but I was very worried about if it is really that beautiful for everybody. I mean, for the Hitler and the Mother Teresa. Number one, it doesn't pay to be so good. And that's a very subjective gut reaction. What is the big deal then? Then live it up if, you know, we all have such a beautiful time. But the other thing that bothered me as a psychiatrist, I guess, is that I began to be worried that if it's that beautiful for everybody, and I would publish that, wouldn't people who are very desperate, and there are so many desperate people in the world, wouldn't that be the last straw that they would then commit suicide? Do you understand that as a psychiatrist I have to be concerned about that? I spent my whole life helping people, and I really would not like to bring on such anguish and agony to any family. And until we had cases of suicide, I could not do this. And then my first case I got was from a minister who attempted suicide. And he wrote me a letter of his experience that was so incredibly beautiful that he could no longer be a minister, because it was contrary to all the things that he was taught. What we have not shared with you yet is that after this beautiful, peaceful separation from the physical body comes something that I think is what we talk about of hell and heaven. And that is that every human being has to review his or her own life at that time. And that is very similar, that is described by people very similar to watching a television screen. And you review your own life. It's like some people tell you when they drown that their whole life was reviewed in front of them, or in Switzerland, naturally, it's the mountain climbers who fall from great height, and it's like their whole life in a panoramic view goes by their eyes. Because when you're out of your physical body, there is no concept of time. This can occur in an instant. Everybody after death occurs has the review of his or her own life. And what you have to review is not only your deeds, and not only your words, but also your thoughts. And because you're on a higher state of consciousness, you are at the same time fully conscious of all the pain and agony and anguish your actions or thoughts have caused others. Do you understand that somebody who commits suicide, that is really going through hell? So when you go home, you have to be aware of not only of your actions, but remember that also your thoughts are affecting the world you live in. The other thing that we learned is that nothing in life is coincidence. Everything in life is in a cycle. like the seasons we experience, like there is a time to be born, and a time to be a child, and a time to grow and mature and contribute and give. But there is also a time to wither and a time to die. You also realize that when death occurs and you make this transition into another state of consciousness, that you are met by people who have existed with you before you exist. And many people, for example in this society who have been married to 5 guys, are very worried, that there is going to be a confusion. I can assure you that there are only 2 things in life that count, and that is genuine love. And very few people understand love. It is not love, I give you something if you give me something back. It is not I love you if you make love to me. It is love without any expectation. And that is perhaps the hardest lesson to learn. There are many more things that we could get into. I don't know or think we have the time. Maybe we'll have more time in questions and answers and in the panel. But I wanted to share with you the end of the story of Mrs. Schwartz. Mrs. Schwartz was my first patient who experienced being dead and coming back to life. She showed me the way how to start this research. She died a year and a half later, about a year after she was dead and buried. I was again in troubles. I was at the crossroad. I felt that I needed to give up this work with dying patients. It had become famous, and when things become famous, they deteriorate. And it's like artificially prolonging life, and it's no longer meaningful. And that day I was determined to give notice at the university and to leave the hospital and the University of Chicago. It wasn't an easy decision because I really loved my patients, but the seminars had become very famous. We had lots of visitors coming, and every week we had to talk about the same stuff. It was like a repeat performance. It had no depth to it. At that time I had lost the most beautiful minister I had ever worked with, who had left Chicago to take over a parish in Urbana, and he was replaced by a minister who was all head but no heart. And he also couldn't listen, and I had a horrible time with him. And I decided I'm going to call it quits before it gets too much of a head trip and a repeat performance. I walked out of my last seminar on death and dying and walked towards the elevator with him, desperately trying to tell him, I'm going to give notice today and it's all yours. And I made this very vigorous attempt 3 times, and he didn't hear me. And finally I got to the elevator where he had to go downstairs to his office, and my office was at the end of a whole long hallway. Finally I thought, if I'm not telling it to him now, I'm going to procrastinate and I will not leave. I know me well enough. So I did something that I don't usually do. He was a very huge guy, and I tiptoed and grabbed him by his neck collar. And I said, you have to listen to me now. I made a terribly important decision. And just as I said that, someone appeared in front of us. And I looked at this woman, and I can't put that in words, but you know what it feels like when you see somebody that you know very well, but you suddenly block and don't know who it is. my thought process was immediately switched gears, and I said to him, who is this? This woman is waiting for me, and I know her so well, but I don't have the slightest idea who it is. And he didn't hear me, and by then I gave up on him, and the last thing I said to him is, to heck with it, I'm just going to walk over to her and admit. And at that moment the elevator came, and he left. And this woman walked towards me and had this incredible smile on her face, like she knew every thought I had. And she said, Dr. Ross, I'm only going to take 2 minutes of your time. If you don't mind, I walk you down to your office. And since she knew my name and where my office was, it was kind of safe to admit that I didn't know who she was. Do you understand my situation? It was the longest walk I have ever taken my whole life. It was a long hallway. It was about from here to the end of this room. I did not know that this was Mrs. Schwartz, the woman who was buried a year ago. But one part of me knew it. But I'm a scientist, and I don't believe in geists and spooks. And that was 8 years ago. And I did the most horrible, incredible reality testing that I've ever done in my life. All the way to my office, I said to myself, you're getting tired. Maybe you need a vacation. And then a few minutes later, I said, you know, how many times have I said to my schizophrenic patients, I know you see that Madonna on the wall, but I don't see it. I said that to myself. I did every conceivable reality testing with myself, but not knowing why I was doing what I was doing. It was like on automatic. By the time we reached the door, I realized that I even tried to touch her to see if there was a feeling to it. Because she looked kind of transparent. Not transparent, but kind of in a waxy way, not that you could see furniture behind her, but not quite real. I know I touched her and she had a feeling to her. And by then, we came to my office and she opened the door to my office, which threw me, like I'm the guest in her house. And she opened the door and she said, I had to come back for 2 reasons. Number one, I wanted to thank you and Rennie Gaines. Rennie Gaines was that beautiful minister. I wanted to thank you and Rennie Gaines once more for what you have done for me. But the real reason why I had to come back is to tell you not to give up your work on death and dying. Not yet. And by then I was at my desk and I was holding on to my desk and to my chair, and I looked at my mess, which was so familiar on my desk, and I did again reality testing, and I looked at her, and I don't know if at that moment I realized, maybe pre-consciously, that this was indeed Mrs. Schwartz, who was buried a year ago. And I looked at her, and I thought nobody would ever believe me if I would tell this to anybody. They really would think I slept. So my scientist in me, very shrewd, I looked at her and I said, you know, Rennie Gaines took over a church in Urbana. He would be thrilled if he would have a note from you. Would you terribly mind? You understand that the scientist in me needed proof. And this woman knew my thoughts. She knew that I lied to her. She knew that I had no intentions whatsoever to ever giving this note to Rennie Gaines. I just needed a sheet of paper with anything written in her handwriting and hopefully her signature. Well, with the biggest smile of love and compassion and understanding, as if she would say, but she didn't say it. It's like I was reading her thoughts. And she actually said to me, but without words, "Are you satisfied now?" And she took a piece of paper and wrote this message on a piece of paper and signed it with her full name. And then I had this paper, and she looked at me once more and she said, "You cannot give up this work on death and dying, not yet. The time is not right. We will help you. You will know when the time is right. You promise." And I remember the last thing I said to her is, "I promise." And with that she got up and walked out. And no sooner was the door closed, I had to go see if that was real. I opened the door and there was not a soul in that long hallway. This was the beginning of a most incredible life I've had. This was 8 years ago. Many, many things happened since, needless to say. The greatest miracle happened 2 weeks ago in San Diego when I attended a holistic medicine conference, and I was informed that my guides are having something in mind for me, to give me encouragement and celebration that I am comfortable talking about those things now. But the main purpose, I think, if I understood right, is that there would be not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that life continues after what we call death. 3 of my guides, the guides are the people who are with you at the moment of your own transitions. 3 of my guides materialized 2 weeks ago and touched me physically. They sang to us, they talked to me, and they invited 75 scientists and very skeptical but loving, not negative people to witness this miracle. I cannot tell you in words what that means. But if any of you have any doubts, if any of the incredible things that are happening in my life now, I will be one day able to share if I ever have a free moment to write it down. You should be very, very aware that not only in death, but in life, you are never alone, because your guides are not more than 2 feet away from you. And if you are ever in trouble, all you have to ask is to ask for help, and they will help you. It will only happen if you ask. And that is also what happens when we go through this review of our life. When we review our life, all of you, and me included, will see very ugly things that we have done in life. Not just actions, but thoughts. I have many times wished to strangle somebody. I have never strangled anybody, but I've wished I could. All these things are going to be reviewed by you, and you have to understand, and I hope you hear that there is no such thing as a punitive, condemning God who is going to shake you up and then send you down to hell for eternity. That doesn't exist. What he does is to give you the opportunity to condemn yourself. And you are your worst enemy. And that is also true of suicide patients. That is true of all of us who have done bad things. The moment we are able to forgive ourselves, we are forgiven. And I think that's terribly important to know. 2 things come out of this besides the fact that death does not exist. Only 2 things in life are relevant. One of them is service. And again, not service for money or service for something in exchange, but simply to serve, to help uplift this very troubled, diseased mankind. And the only thing that is really relevant is love. And I think Richard Allen said this more beautiful than anybody can say in his poem to his father after his death. He ended the poem by saying, when you love, give it everything you have got. And when you have reached your limit, give it more. And forget the pain of it. Because as you face your death, it is only the love you have given and received which will count. And all the rest, the accomplishments, the struggles, the fights will be forgotten in your reflection. And if you have loved well, then it will have been worth it. And the joy of it will last you through the end. But if you have not, death will always come too soon and be too terrible to face. So, to finish up, I'm going to play you some music. Music is one of the most important ingredients in working with dying patients. Instead of machines, we should at least replace half the machines with music in our institutions, for the few that we cannot take home to die. We use music a lot. Liz died with music. Most of my patients die with music of their own choice. And when you are in this business, you naturally pick your own music too that you love. And I'm playing the song to you that I have, for the time being, chosen as my funeral song, because it summarizes everything that I would like people to remember. And that's going to be the end of it. After this, we'll have a lunch break.
Wherever you go, I shall go. Wherever you live, so shall I live. Your people will be my and your God will be my God too. Wherever you die, I shall die, and there shall I be buried beside you. We will be together forever, and our love will be the gift of our life. I want to say something to all of you who have become a part of the fabric of my life. The color and texture which you have brought into my being have become a song, and I want to sing it forever. There is an energy in us which makes things happen when the paths of other persons touch ours, and we have to be there and let it happen. When the time of our particular sunset comes, our thing, our accomplishment, won't really matter a great deal. vitality, of the great gift of life we have been for each other. Wherever you go, I shall go. Wherever you live, so shall I live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God too. Wherever you die, I shall die, and there shall I be buried beside you. We will be together forever, and our love will be the gift of our life. We will be together forever, and our love will be the gift of our life.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.